Hi, thank you so much for coming. So my name is Jude. I'm a co-VP for the Food Law Society. Food Law Society is a student org at HLS that fosters on-campus dialogue on food law and policy issues. We support the network of students, professionals, and food lovers who support a healthier, more equitable food system. So we are also very thankful to our co-sponsors, HLS Student Animal Legal Defense Fund and HLS Environmental Law Society. Today we're going to talk about meat alternatives. One of the innovation is what you're eating right now. And we're going to focus our discussion on plant-based meats. So first, we're going to talk about why we need meat alternatives, and what are the meat innovations, and how we should go about in regulating this new industry. So we are very lucky to have our two panelists today. Matthew Hayek is an environmental scientist and a farm animal law and policy fellow at the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. His research concerns greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural activities. He's interested in using quantitative tools to empower food system stakeholders, thereby enabling them to more clearly visualize the environmental constraints and burdens associated with food production transitions within their areas of interest. Nicole Negowetti is a clinical instructor of the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. Prior to joining the clinic, Nicole was policy director of the Good Food Institute, a nonprofit organization focused on creating a sustainable, healthy, and humane food system by supporting transformative plant-based and cultured food technology companies. Nicole also serves on the Food and Drug Law Journal and Editorial Advisory Board, and is a founding member of the Academy of Food Law and Policy. So turn over to you guys.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.
And then I can. All right, thanks everyone for coming today. This is definitely more of a turnout than we expected. I'm hoping everyone got a chance to fight for a burger. It's very we decided to set it up in a very carnal style. So if you weren't gonna kill any cows today,
fight
then maybe
for your meat.
Fight for your meat at the very least. So today we're talking about plant-based meats, which is what you're eating right now, and the subtitle is the future of protein. And essentially, the way that I'm going to kick this off is to make the case for why we actually need a new future for protein, rather than creating light or even deeper forms on the meat-producing system that we already have. There are a lot of problems with this system that you could discuss from across a whole gamut of issues, from landscape preservation and antibiotic resistance, public health, nutrition. But the angle that I most want to focus on today, because it's my area of expertise, is environmental impacts. I'm going to focus on why the current system we have of feeding crops to animals and then harvesting the flesh off of that animal is a very inefficient system. It's inefficient and it intrinsically produces a lot of waste. So essentially the conversations that we're having today about waste are good, they're heading in the right direction, but they're still misguided. And I want to help steer that back on track. A lot of conversations about food waste today focus on the amount of food that companies and individual consumers throw out into the trash in our quest for perfect looking and perfect tasting food. What those conversations, however, don't mention is how much waste is embodied in animal flesh. The reason why waste is intrinsic to animal farming is this basic scientific concept of ecological efficiency or trophic efficiency. We feed all ourselves and animals, the animals that we eat, plants, which get their energy from the sun. They fix atmospheric carbon through photosynthesis and kind of preserve that energy in their tissues. But each step up the food chain, any animal that eats those plants only captures about a small fraction of that energy in the mass of their bodies. So by the time we eat that animal, we've captured only at most 11% of that original plant energy when it, does that laser pointer even work? All right. Oh, there it goes. Yeah, 11%. Number was small. Of that energy, in our diets from eating those animals. This conversion ratio is slightly more efficient for protein, but not an order of magnitude more. It's pretty similar. Let's see. I booped you. Come on. 1 second. There we go. All right. And all this waste contributes to climate change. It contributes to a bunch of issues. It contributes to eutrophication in dead zones. It contributes to odors, particulate matter, ammonia, public health concerns. The one that I'm going to focus on again, because it's in my wheelhouse, is climate impacts. Our most recent estimate from the Food and Agriculture Organization puts it around 15% of all of our greenhouse gases coming from livestock. The reason that the waste contributes to all the food waste that's intrinsic to animal agriculture contributes to this issue is because in order to grow the crops, in order to feed the animals, we need to produce much more fertilizer and clear much more land to produce the animal feed. And those animals in turn produce more manure than we know what to do with. All of these processes are contributors of greenhouse gases. 3 greenhouse gases to be exact: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. It's not just CO2. This total here already accounts, the 15% of all greenhouse gases already accounts for the fact that methane and nitrous oxide on a per molecule level are more efficient at warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide is. So it's adjusted for that fact. The next couple of slides are kind of going to challenge the mainstream arguments that I've heard about how we can reform this system to make it substantially more efficient, sustainable, or restorative. So one fix that you hear pretty often is this local food fix, the idea of being a locavore and eating more farm to table, sourcing from farms that are more directly, more proximate to where exactly we're eating our food. But a study that came out in 2008 shows that only 11% of our entire food system, only 11% of the emissions from our entire food system, of the greenhouse gas emissions, come from transporting our food, with only about 4% from the kind of final provider or seller of that food to the grocery store, to our tables. Most of that transport is actually transporting feed to animal operations, with the raising and growing of our food counting for 83%, the vast majority of all of our climate emissions stemming from agriculture, or the entire food system. Of that 83%, 75%, so the majority of that is in turn contributed to by animals. On that animal feed point, taking Midwest grain to a southern chicken feeding operation is a large chunk of that transportation, as is if you're eating a local pig. If you're eating local pork that was raised in Shelburne, Massachusetts, virtually none of the feed that pig ate actually came from New England. So the mass of that pig, the actual embodied food, is about as close to local food as a box of Frosted Flakes. Let's see. But if the production side has so many environmental burdens, maybe we can reform that somehow. Another strategy for reforming that I've heard is grass feeding animals, raising them on pasture, doing holistic management and rotations. The image of a cow grazing in lush green fields is very pleasant. We can feel good about eating something that came from that environment. But it has perniciously hidden externalities. There's a byproduct of cows eating grass, because we can't, like us sitting here in this room, we can't eat grass, but cows can, and they can turn it into mass, and they can fatten up on it. Does anyone know why that is? Like why cows can eat grass? Has anyone heard like what process enables them to do it? It's fermentation. There's bacteria in their stomachs that converts the roughage and cellulose of grass and break it down into carbohydrates, protein, amino acids, and fatty acids, much like what we can digest. And it passes down into stomach chambers a lot like the ones we have that are chewing through that burger that you guys, well, largely just already ate. Good job. Because cows need to ferment all of this rough cellulose, in any fermentation process that doesn't have oxygen in it, the byproduct is going to be methane. So the counterintuitive thing that not a lot of people realize is that cows eating grass actually produce more global warming methane than cows on feedlots eating corn and soy. Because those cows are eating those carbohydrates, those fatty acids, those amino acids. They're getting those directly. So there's an idea by some, including Alan Savory, who's 10 million times viewed TED Talk. He talks about like the benefits of holistic grazing and management and carbon soil sequestration, that we can somehow use cows to trap carbon back into the soil. But that's incredibly challenging to do. And no one mentions that it's impossible to legislate or regulate for a national industry. Not only is it challenging to do, the circumstances are widely variant and with great degrees of success or failure and reproducibility. So finally, just this last year, there was a study that was put out called Grazed and Confused by the Food Climate Research Network, which stated that while cows grazing on grass can boost the sequestration of carbon in some locally specific circumstances, the effect is time-limited, reversible, and at the global level substantially outweighed by the greenhouse gases they generate because of that methane conversion issue. This led to the conclusion where the lead researcher, Dr. Tara Garnett, stated that maintaining current consumption levels but simply switching to grass-fed beef is not a solution. Eating less meat of all types is. So instead of looking for these scenarios where we have one maybe animal welfare benefit with the trade-off of another harm that's caused, including like increased erosion, biodiversity loss, increased greenhouse gas emissions, I think that we need to start looking desperately for these win-win scenarios, or more accurately, like win-win-win-win-win. Because instead of trying to take an inefficient system and trying to nudge efficiency, flavor, or welfare in one small direction to the detriment of others, we can actually look for issues that have benefits for climate, public health, water use and erosion, animals, and our own wallets. And to this effect, there was a study that came out regarding these co-benefits just this year that stated if everyone in the country, and they used some really simple modeling in this study, and their finding was that if everyone in the country just substituted beans on a protein basis for the beef that they were eating right now, we could meet our formerly Paris Agreement goals of greenhouse gas reductions by 2020 by 46 to 74% just by that one step, instead of massively changing our infrastructure and our fuel efficiency standards. Beans, by the way, are incredibly healthy food. They have tons of soluble fiber. It's great for gut health. They have calcium and iron in them, whole host of benefits. But no meat eater that I know wants to substitute their tofu or their like weirdly sweet Bush's baked beans for their steak. That's not like a reasonable strategy to just like convince people who are big meat lovers to just make that switch immediately. There's a big perception issue. There's a big marketing problem. And most people just don't realize that, like, what's my next slide here? Beans don't have to suck. This is a recipe that I made that I got off of pop sugar that I love. I always tend to eat black eyed peas for New Year's to bring in some good luck for the new year, and hopefully like that had some effect. Because, God knows we could all use it. These were great. And, made my own barbecue sauce for them, blended up some chipotle peppers, roasted them in the oven for like 6 hours. They were awesome. And it was like a passive process. And it wasn't like laboring over the stove. I just threw it all in a pan and stuck it in the oven, and it was great. And this, to me, is way more appetizing than any salad bar with that cold tray of slimy, wet kidney beans that I'm sure exists like over in Harkness here. And it's just like in every salad bar in the country. Like, this is way better than that, I think. So ultimately, my hope is that through better marketing, better development, more chefs getting involved, we can somehow expand the definition of what meat is to include all of the proteins that sustain us. They give us these climate and health co-benefits. and give us a much needed sense of vibrancy and actually lift us up after we're done eating, rather than like feeling bloated and heavy and just not feeling good when we're done with a meal. But consumer preferences haven't caught up yet, so there's an urgent need to create something that more directly replicates the center stage role that meat plays in people's lives, instead of the longer work of kind of shifting consumer perceptions. From an environmental vantage point, for the rest of this, we're going to talk about beef, because that's where the biggest climate impacts are. That's where a lot of the innovation is happening right now. One more point that I want to make is that if things are bad in the US, they're definitely kind of they're growing exponentially larger in a lot of other countries on Earth. And this is an ad from Kfc and Ghana, where Kfc is like huge now. Eating fried chicken in Ghana used to be something that folks only did to celebrate a holiday. And actually, this ad is for Republic Day in Ghana, which is an Independence Day of theirs, where they were the first sub-Saharan African nation to free themselves of colonial rule in 1960. So, you know, there was like a buy one, get one free deal that KFC had going on. And I find this really interesting from a number of perspectives, from like, you know, the southern plantation owner's face on the bucket of chicken, the fact that, you know, we have KFC in, you know, an American company in all of these additional countries on Earth because of the, basically because of neocolonialism. And there was one interesting quote that I found from a New York Times article where a professor from Amsterdam surveyed diners at these KFCs, where one person said that like eating the local foods, the local stews that they were used to eating in Ghana, is now frowned upon, and people see this Western type of eating as more civilized. So to put more of these trends in a global perspective, I'm going to hand it off to Nicole, who's also going to talk more about the public health and innovation and regulatory issues around new developments.
Sure, thank you, Matt. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. So I think Matt made some extremely persuasive arguments for why we should eat beans, or at least other alternatives to meat. But the ethical and even environmental arguments can only take us so far, and they've had limited success thus far. And so all signs point to increased demand for meat. And that is in response to a growing middle class across the world, and the between 9 to 10 billion people who will populate this planet by 2050. So people want to eat meat. We heard a lot about the environmental arguments for shifting diets, but I would be remiss not to highlight some of the public health reasons as well. Leading organizations are pretty clear about the benefits of plant-based diets. We hear from the American Heart Association that a diet that emphasizes plant-based foods compared to animal-based foods can lower the risk of dying from heart disease and stroke by up to 20%. The Cancer Research Institute also says when it comes to American health, the research shows one thing very clearly: we all need to eat more plants and less meat. We hear the same thing from Johns Hopkins, and a similar message from the National Academy of Sciences. So ethical arguments, not working. Environmental arguments, also not working. Calls from these leading public health organizations, also not getting people to shift to plant-based diets. So what can we do? Well, we're going to talk about the market approach. So let's take a trip along the evolution of different alternatives to meat using plants. So first, the old school Boca burger. I remember eating these in college. How many of you have had the Boca burger? Okay, a lot of you, that's great. How many of you enjoy eating the Boca burger? Not too many of you. Okay.
A couple of these.
right, that's what I thought. So we're starting here. These are made of soy protein. I think everyone in this room can agree that this product itself would not be enough to shift a carnivore to a plant-based diet, okay? So the market realized, okay, we need to innovate. So then we get to the Beyond Burger. How many of you have tried this? Okay, great. A lot of you, yes, I have it in my fridge. So this is an innovative product made with pea protein and coconut oil, and it bleeds. Now the bleeding here is just from beet juice, so it gives it the pink color. Okay. So here's the CEO, Ethan Brown, eating the Beyond Burger, and next to him is the steer. So this is a really neat contraption called an extruder. And what it does, it combines all of the ingredients here. So we have primarily the pea protein, the coconut oil, flavors, the beet juice, and puts all of the ingredients together and processes it in such a way that it extrudes all those ingredients out and gives it that meaty texture. Okay, so here we have an example of using innovation. But we're going to take it to the next level here with the Impossible Burger, okay, which you are all enjoying. So the secret ingredient here in the Impossible Burger that gives it that meaty taste is from heme. So heme is an iron-containing molecule that is in all of our blood. It's in every living thing. In meat, it's concentrated 100 times more than in plants. So they did extensive studies over a period of years to identify what is it that gives it that meaty flavor, and that's what they found to be that secret ingredient. So the good news is that you can replicate this heme, which is identical to the heme found in animals. You can do so in plants. And they found it in the roots of soy. So if we were to gather up all of the soy roots and extract the heme from that, unfortunately, it would be a very inefficient process, very resource intensive. In fact, for 1 acre of soy that would be growing, if you were to extract the heme in that natural way, you could only get 1 kilogram. So again, we would very resource intensive. So they figured out a way to do it using genetic engineering. Okay, still with the Impossible Burger. So they're able to do it with genetic engineering, and the way they do that is by inserting the gene for this heme into yeast, and they feed the yeast sugar, and it replicates the heme. And then they separate the yeast and are left with just the heme. So for the scientists in the room, please forgive my oversimplification of that process, but that's basically what it is. Now, it may sound very sci-tech and strange, but they've been doing this for decades. In fact, this is the way that they create rennet, which is on cheese. And naturally occurring rennet, does anyone know where that comes from? Rennet? From the stomachs of calves, okay? So we can go on and on about all the reasons not to do that, right? So instead, they use this fermentation process using yeast to create rennet. They're doing the same thing here with the Impossible Burger to create the secret ingredient, or heme. Okay? So taking it to the absolute next level, it's cleaner culture meat. We're not going to focus on that today, but I did want to mention it, and stay tuned for another edition of these lunch talks for more detailed instructions. But cleaner culture meat, I'm sure most of you have already heard of it. This is creating molecularly indistinguishable animal meat without animal slaughter. So I hope that's enough to pique your interest if you have not yet heard of it, and stay tuned for another talk about it. So all of these are efforts to use a market approach to transform conventional animal agriculture. I've said several times that all of these other arguments that are being made to shift people away from eating animal products have been limited in their success. What do consumers care about? They care about taste, they care about price, and they care about convenience. So all of these companies are innovating to address all of those issues. And by all accounts, they are extremely successful. So I have Beyond Meat, creators of the Beyond Burger, Hampton Creek, which is working to explore various plant and also cultured proteins, and then Impossible Foods. So far they've raised about $400 million, and they're valued at $2 billion. All of the leading investors are getting on board here, including this guy, Bill Gates. And so he has this quote that so far we've only explored about 8% of the world's plant proteins as potential meat alternatives. Remaking meat is one sector of the food industry that is ripe for innovation and growth. So when we think about plant-based burgers, we think about that Boca soy burger. We think about seitan or using wheat, right? Or now chickpeas or pea proteins. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are all these plant proteins that have not been explored. So the evolution is going to continue. So we need research funding, and we need new companies to start exploring and developing so that ultimately consumers won't have to make a sacrifice. That's really the goal of these companies, so that someone who wants a burger, they don't have to think, well, am I going to be making the ethical, environmentally correct choice? Well, I guess I'll settle for that Impossible Burger, I'll settle for the Boca Burger, God forbid. No, it'll be an easy choice. Oh, this is just as delicious, so I won't have to think twice about eating it. Oh, and bonus, it doesn't involve animal slaughter. It's better for the environment and it's healthier for me. So it's not just key investors who are getting on board, but this quote, the demand for plant proteins is skyrocketing and needs to be considered and accounted for in business planning. Failure to see around corners and adjust to changing demands places the company at a great disadvantage relative to its competitors in the food industry who are already innovating in this area. Who said this? Tyson Foods shareholders. So Tyson, Cargill are recognizing the potential of these plant proteins to transform conventional animal agriculture, and they're getting on board. They're investing in the companies. They have invested in Beyond Meat. Okay, so we're in a law school, so let's talk about the regulatory challenges and whether the agencies are nimble enough to deal with these innovative products. Okay, so we talked about the genetic engineering of the heme that is in the Impossible Burger to give it that meaty taste. Now, the fact that they're using genetic engineering in and of itself is not problematic from a legal or regulatory perspective, because the FDA's longstanding position has been that it's the end product, not the process of creating that ingredient that matters as far as regulations are concerned. So there's no different regulatory scheme or requirements just because genetic modification is being used. But let's kind of dive into some of the potentially problematic issues. Let's start with the semantic issue. What is meat? We're throwing that word around a lot, right? What is meat? Let's get some ideas from you guys. When you think of meat, what does that mean?
Animal product.
Think of animals. I'm sorry? What do you think? I thought I heard something. Cows, animals, okay? So that's what we think of. Well, if you think about what comprises meat, it's amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates, minerals, and water, okay? So if these are presented in the same structure, with the same architecture, could it be considered the same thing? So this is a quote from Ethan Brown, CEO of Beyond Meat. So his perspective is that he is creating meat. He is creating a combination of amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates, minerals, and water. So they are making meat. So eat your meat, eat from plants. And he has been very successful in product placement. So he has negotiated with Whole Foods to sell his Beyond Burger right in the meat case, so that people can start shifting the way that they think about what meat is. Okay? His product is in the meat section, therefore it's meat. Okay, what does the USDA think of meat? Well, unfortunately, it's the same thing that you guys all thought of initially. We won't have to go through this in detail, but part of the muscle of any cattle, sheep, swine, or goats would just skeletal. So if that's the USDA's interpretation of what constitutes meat, how could that be problematic from a legal regulatory perspective? How can that get the companies in trouble? Yes?
Well, meat companies may sue if the plant-based companies try to advertise it as meat. Like
Sure.
with the mayo that happened, right?
Sure, right. So, problem with lawsuits, problem with liability. So it gets us into the question of whether there's a potential for misleading or confusing consumers by calling a plant-based product meat. Okay? So there are standards of identity promulgated by the FDA and USDA, which are basically codified recipes. To call ketchup ketchup, it has to have certain components, percentages of tomatoes and vinegar and other ingredients. Same is true with mayonnaise. You raised that issue. That was the issue there. For something to be called mayonnaise, it's supposed to have egg and a combination of other ingredients. Well, to call something a hamburger, it shall consist of chopped, fresh, and or frozen beef, etc., etc. So you'll notice that the products are generally not called hamburgers, but rather called burgers to kind of get around these standards of identity, which again bring us back to a labeling question, and the issue being whether it confuses or misleads consumers. So a more complicated issue is the regulatory approval of food additives. So I had mentioned that the fact that genetic engineering is used in the creation of the heme in the Impossible Burger is not problematic in and of itself. However, there was a controversy in regards to the heme that was ultimately produced. And that is because even though I said heme is in all things, it's in plants, it's in animals, it's been consumed and is part of us forever, introducing it in this way is novel. And so in general, the FDA has pre-market approval and requires studies to be conducted to show the safety of a new ingredient, if it's a food additive that has not been used before. However, if a food manufacturer has enough evidence from recognized experts that the ingredient is generally recognized as safe, that there's common knowledge throughout the scientific community that the substance is not harmful, then it's called GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. So, the FDA, rather recently, issued a final rule. There was a controversy about whether this GRAS process would be required of all companies introducing novel ingredients, or whether it would just be voluntary. And the FDA decided it would be voluntary. So, the negative of that, and this has been criticized, as you can imagine, by environmental groups, public health groups, is that the FDA relies on industry to make the decision about whether they want to come forward to the agency with evidence showing that the ingredient is safe. They're under no obligation to do so. And so there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of novel ingredients in our food system that the agency is not aware of, and that means we're not aware of them either, because this is a voluntary system. So, Impossible Foods, if you look at their website, if you hear the CEO, Pat Brown, talking, he is very committed to being as transparent as possible. And so, even though they're not required to provide any evidence to the FDA about the safety of their product, they went ahead and did so. And so they underwent this GRAS notification process, presented evidence from leading experts across the country conducting toxicology studies. They went through a detailed study showing that there's no risk of any allergenicity. And unfortunately, the FDA concluded, now I bring this to your attention after you've all eaten the Impossible Burger, FDA believes that the arguments presented individually and collectively do not establish the safety of soy-like hemoglobin, that's heme, for consumption, nor do they point to a general recognition of safety. Now, don't panic. This does not necessarily mean that the product is unsafe or the ingredient is unsafe, but the FDA had some follow-up questions. So one of those questions centered around the fact that in addition to the heme molecule that is found in the burger, there's also 40 other yeast-type proteins in there. And so submitting safety only of the heme is not sufficient to demonstrate that the whole product is safe. So they want more information, and Impossible Foods is going to comply by having other studies done, presenting more information to the FDA. But again, going back to the point that it's totally a voluntary process, they are nevertheless going to comply with the requests of the FDA. So, the future of food, what does it look like? Well, according to Richard Branson, who has a lot of money and has invested heavily in all of these companies that we've talked about, he says, I believe that in 30 years or so, we will no longer need to kill any animals, And then all meat will either be clean or plant-based, and that will lead to a much healthier future for everyone. So we can only hope that that's how it will occur, and I feel very strongly that this market approach is a way to get people to shift their dietary choices. So we'd love to take questions at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt and Nicole. So we're gonna open the floor for questions from you guys. So if anyone has questions, please.
So I have a question. I'm not too knowledgeable on any subject matter, but I've heard about sort of switch to soy and also to almonds, for example, and replacing milk, and that can have potential environmentally damaging effects or sort of dependencies, and also the effects on indigenous people. So I was wondering, is that true? Can you speak more about that? What's going on there?
I certainly can't speak to those differences across the board. For instance, like indigenous land rights is like a really complicated issue that I'm not even going to attempt to wade into. But at least in terms of water use, almonds are a pretty inefficient way of converting, using water to grow a crop that you then kind of leach the nutrients into water and then drink it, but still not as inefficient as milk. It takes about a gallon of water to produce a single almond, but it takes about 100 to something like 100 to 2,000 gallons of milk to produce gallons of water to produce a gallon of milk. I think, and soy is an incredibly environmentally efficient way of procuring protein. That's not to say that like monoculturing these crops is without its detriments. There are certainly better ways that we could be growing the food that we're either feeding ourselves or feeding to animals. The argument is that whatever way we're growing our food, it's less efficient to filter that food through animals and then harvest their bodies than it is to consume that food directly. But then at that point, we can have arguments and conversations about the most efficient ways for us to get the nutrients from those plants directly, including the best crops to be sourcing our plant milk from, or to consume for our health, or the best ways to, process them in any way.
I'm wondering if there's been any discussion of viable plans for shifting the way our agriculture industry towards this in a way that is supportive of our welfare as a society and our economy and doesn't have damaging effects there.
Well, so there are conversations that you may be hearing now about the Farm Bill, which is up for reauthorization in 2018. And so a lot of the conversations are focused on providing support for farmers who are growing healthy crops and not providing support subsidies to farmers who are growing soy and corn, most of which are being fed to animals who are then being slaughtered. So there are lots of conversations happening about providing those supports to encourage people to grow organic, to grow a variety of crops.
You're talking about shifting away from an animal-based agricultural system at all. So when you're talking about a win-win-win situation, there's one group of people who isn't going to win, and that's people who raise animals for slaughter. So that's what I was asking about.
So, I think
So replacing their livelihoods with something else? Does that kind of get to the question? Right. So it's shifting. I mean, that's happened in a lot of industries as well. So farmers who are raising animals for slaughter or growing crops that are going to animals who are being slaughtered can innovate and adapt and grow products that people are now going to consume. And so the demand will shift, and I think farmers will have to shift along with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly like to see policy-based transitions so that that shift isn't, doesn't happen in as turbulent of a way. I think the Farm Bill would be part and parcel of that, providing farmers with multiple options for crops that they can grow, because if you want to turn a profit, right now, as a farmer, you have to heavily consolidate your operations. You have to grow 1 out of 5 crops or 1 out of 3 different animals. And even then, you're really only going to be breaking those margins if you can scale up your operation at a ridiculous level, which already leaves family farmers in the dust. So I think giving farmers their more options about what they can viably grow and produce to be able to turn a profit is really the answer.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but in these meat industries, as far as I know, like they are heavily owned and operated by large food companies. So when we talk about like farmers, we always don't think about these like local house farming type of situation, which is not really the case. And the farmers who now works for these big companies are under a lot of pressure, also to remain profitable. A lot of they're exploited by like large companies. So maybe we're not quite sure whether it's better for them to like for us to like keep their like farming practices as is.
Hi. I think my concern is less with Annie. I think we're seeing in the Central Valley that farmers are proving to be incredibly resilient with changing the sorts of products that they produce to respond to the market. My concern would be that there's a parallel movement going on in this country to shift people away from processed foods. Right. And the Beyond Burger has some odd 30 ingredients in it: methyl cellulose, acetic acid, clarified potato starch. And these are not things that necessarily we want people eating as well. What do we say to the concern that by moving people over to Impossible Foods, Beyond Burgers, that we're continuing to say, don't know anything about where your food comes from? It's in that meat, section. Just whatever it is, whatever animal it came from, whatever plant, we're continuing to try to just obfuscate the process from people.
Yeah, I think our way of producing meat, either conventionally or even organically, as I mentioned, local farming of animals almost never being local when you actually look at where their feed is being sourced from. And those are the best players, in that market. The worst are, making it illegal for you even to like film that operation from across the street. So if we want to talk about an obscure, obfuscated process, I think, a meat in and of itself might be a cut of meat might be minimally processed, but it has gone through a whole host of industrial processes in order to make it to that shelf. So I would just counter that from one standpoint. And I think in no food system can you demand a pure or an entirely pure or clean food system. I think a lot of these conversations we need to be having are about massive harm reduction for public health and the environment. And I think that's precisely what these burgers accomplish, and products like this accomplish. And I think it's what the kind of purity that's demanded around a lack of processed food completely obfuscates.
I think there are 2 other points, and you raised a very good issue about natural and pure. So the first point is that the target audience for the Impossible Burger, it's actually not most of the people in this room. It's not really intended for vegans or vegetarians. It's intended for people who would otherwise go to McDonald's and get a fast food burger, and they want that greasy, meaty taste. And so for this generation of products, their goal is to mimic meat as closely as possible. In the next evolution, they will be more considerate of making it healthier. But for right now, they're just trying to convert those people who don't really care about the health implications. They care about the taste, the price, and the convenience. So that's the target audience, so I think that's important for us to keep in mind. The other point in regards to natural and wanting to eat natural meats, 99% of the meat that's produced comes from factory farms. There's nothing natural about those places. There's nothing natural about the animals that are eaten. They are genetically engineered to grow as fast as possible. In fact, the chickens grow such large breasts because we want to eat white meat in this country that they cannot even stand up. We pump the animals full of hormones and antibiotics because they live in horrible conditions. There's nothing natural about that, so I would say that people are eating meat regardless and despite the way that it's produced. So I think those are 2 important points to think about. Chris?
I would just add to that question about the labor. Market forces already driving it that sort of squeezing people out anyway. So for every 6 active farmers that are over the age of 65, there's currently only 1 under the age of 35. So there's just people are just not going in for economic reasons anyway. So it's already sort of coming up.
There was a question here.
Yeah, so I was super fascinated by the differences in definition. Hi.
Sorry, I'm gonna amplify your voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The recording's gonna catch it.
Okay, so I was super fascinated by the differences in definition of like the FDA's or the USDA's definition of meat versus defining it in terms of structure and ingredients and things like that. And I was wondering, like, the immediate thing that I thought of when trying to define meat was nut meats, and like, where would nuts fall into these definitions? And like, does the USDA therefore consider like things called nut meats an illegal labeling?
That is an open question. So there has been a movement to change the standards of identity and to modernize them to recognize more healthful products. And it's very promising because the FDA announced that one of its priorities for 2018 was to focus on nutrition, and they listed standards of identity as one of the areas that they are going to revisit and reconsider. So I'm hopeful that they will recognize a product such as nut meat as not being misleading to consumers because there's a qualifier, nuts, in front of the word meat. But again, that's an open question. So as it stands, that's the USDA's definition for what meat is. But it's evolving, and I would argue needs to be modernized.
This is way less of a professional take on that question, but I was at Trader Joe's recently, and I was making some baklava, and I wanted to buy the pistachios that were already shelled, because I forget having to like just sit there and shuck every one of them. And noticed that they actually advertise it with nut meat as one word, rather than 2. Which I thought was a pretty awkward way to do it. I was like, that doesn't sound appetizing at all. But there might have been a legal reason for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, question here.
Okay, so I don't really know too much about this area in general, but so I'm kind of curious in terms of trying to shift people who are already, carnivores into being more open-minded about, not eating meat and pork and things like that. Do you think it's viable or wise to kind of also shift the discussion towards things like farmed fish, where I don't really know, but I'm assuming the carbon emissions and that's great. And that's like a good.
Yeah, it's again it's like one of those things where the answer is always it depends. There's just like huge variation because there's about a half a dozen ways that you can farm fish. But like at the very least, the impacts are kind of like they go from being like a little nasty to like pretty devastating even compared to beef. So yeah. There are definitely conversations about it, and the next stage of innovations actually involves plant and cell cultured seafoods as well. So sustainability is a huge issue when it comes to seafood, and we're running out of resources. Not only the fish that we fish directly and wild catch from the ocean themselves, but the feed for farmed fish is other much smaller wild caught fish. So either we're running out of the fish to eat, or we're running out of the fish that we need to feed the fish we eat. So it's definitely coming up to one of those kind of like ecological limits as of right now. And again, I think that's the reason we need like a big market revolution in this area and not just a way to reform the system.
Right. And in addition to the smaller fish that are fed, there's also all the byproducts from factory farms, like chicken feather meal and things like that are also fed to the fish.
Yeah.
So unsustainable and unhealthy.
Kind of nasty.
Right.
Yeah.
So because some people have like 1 o'clock class, we might actually officially close the floor.
Sure.
But can you guys like stay here a little longer
We can hang out
for
and
if
take
anyone has more questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Sounds good. Yeah. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
you're
Thanks, everyone.
free to leave.
Thanks so much.